That car costs more than you've ever earned in your life, my husband's sister said with a smile as she pulled the keys out of my hand. Everyone around her laughed. I laughed too. They thought they were embarrassing me. They had no idea what was waiting for them just a few hours later. My name is Charlotte Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I've learned that people reveal their true character when they believe they are standing above you. The Caldwell family had spent years convincing themselves they belonged to a different class of people. They loved expensive labels, luxury resorts, imported sports cars, and conversations about money. Most importantly, they loved making sure everyone knew about it. The family reunion that summer was held at a luxury mountain resort outside Aspen, Colorado. My husband, Richard, had passed away 4 years earlier, but his family still invited me to their annual gatherings. At least, that's what they called them. In reality, they were competitions disguised as vacations. Every dinner became a contest. Every conversation turned into a comparison. Who bought the bigger house? Who drove the newer car? Who had the most successful children? By the second day, I was already exhausted. That morning, the family gathered outside the lodge parking area. A brand new Porsche sat in the sunlight, polished so perfectly that the mountains reflected off its surface. Ethan Caldwell, my brother-in-law, stood proudly beside it with his arms crossed. Vanessa, his wife, circled the vehicle like it was a museum exhibit. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she asked loudly. "Not everyone gets to sit in something like this." Several family members nodded in agreement. I smiled politely and complimented the car. Truthfully, I knew very little about sports cars. I've never been impressed by objects. My late husband used to say that the loudest displays of wealth often came from the people trying hardest to prove they had it. When Ethan offered everyone a chance to sit inside, I stepped forward with the rest of the group. Before I could reach the driver's door, Vanessa suddenly moved in front of me. "Actually," she said, reaching for the key fob, "maybe not everyone." The group went silent for a moment. Then she smiled. "Insurance can be complicated. We'd hate for anything to happen." A few people chuckled nervously. Others looked away. The message was obvious. She wasn't worried about insurance. She was worried about me touching something she believed was far beyond my station in life. I looked at her. Then I looked at the key in her hand. For a brief moment, I considered reminding her that I had been driving longer than she'd been alive. Instead, I simply smiled. "You're right," I said calmly. "It's your car." Vanessa seemed disappointed by my response. I think she had hoped for an argument. People like Vanessa often do. They enjoy the performance more than the victory. We headed back inside for lunch, and the jokes continued. Small comments, little reminders, remarks about retirement, remarks about fixed incomes, remarks about how expensive modern luxuries had become. I listened quietly. The funny thing was that none of them had ever asked a single question about my life. Not one. They had created an entire story about who Charlotte Whitmore was. A retired widow. A pleasant older woman living comfortably on memories and a pension. They believed they knew everything. As I sat near the window watching the afternoon sunlight move across the mountains, my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen and saw a message that made me smile for a very different reason. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. I slipped the phone back into my purse and looked across the table at Vanessa. She was busy telling everyone how exclusive their next destination would be. I simply nodded and listened. In a few hours, every assumption in that room was about to collapse. The rest of the afternoon passed exactly the way I expected. The Caldwell family moved from one conversation about money to another as if they were reading from the same script they had followed for years. Ethan talked about investment properties. Vanessa discussed luxury memberships. Harold compared country clubs. Every story seemed designed to answer a question nobody had asked. How important are we? I sat quietly and stirred my iced tea, listening more than speaking. That had become one of my habits after Richard passed away. People reveal far more when they think nobody is paying attention. By 4 o'clock, the group had gathered in the main lounge overlooking the mountains. The view was spectacular. Pine trees stretched across the valley for miles, and patches of late summer snow still clung to the highest peaks. Most people would have spent their time admiring the scenery. The Caldwells were admiring themselves. Vanessa sat near the fireplace, scrolling through photographs on her phone. Every few minutes she would turn the screen toward someone and point out a designer handbag, a luxury resort, or a celebrity restaurant she had visited. The reactions were always the same. Gasps, compliments, admiration. It was a performance they all knew by heart. At one point, Vanessa looked directly at me. "Charlotte, have you ever been to St. Bart's?" she asked. Before I could answer, she added, "Actually, never mind. It is probably not your kind of destination." A few relatives laughed. I smiled politely. "You might be surprised," I replied. Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. "Trust me, some places are just different." Different. It was an interesting word. People often use it when they want to create distance without sounding rude. I looked around the room and wondered how many of them truly believed the image they worked so hard to maintain. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a call. I excused myself and stepped outside onto a stone terrace overlooking the valley. The afternoon air was cool and clean. "Good afternoon, Ms. Whitmore," a familiar voice said. "Everything is prepared. We will be ready whenever you arrive." I thanked him and ended the call. For a moment, I stood alone watching the clouds drift across the mountains. Richard used to love views like this. He always said that real success was not about impressing strangers. It was about having choices. The freedom to go where you wanted. The freedom to say no. The freedom to live quietly if you wished. I slipped the phone into my purse and returned inside. Nobody asked about the call. Nobody seemed interested. They were too busy discussing a business venture Ethan hoped would attract new investors. That caught my attention. Investors. Suddenly, several pieces of the puzzle began fitting together. The expensive vacations. The constant status displays. The endless conversations about wealth. Perhaps this gathering was not really about family at all. Perhaps everyone was trying to convince someone of something. As evening approached, Vanessa stood and announced tomorrow's travel plans with the confidence of a cruise director. Everyone applauded. I glanced at the clock on the wall and smiled. In less than 12 hours, the entire tone of this vacation was going to change. The next morning began earlier than usual. I woke before sunrise and sat near the window of my suite with a cup of coffee warming my hands. The mountains were still wrapped in shadows, and the valley below looked peaceful, untouched by the noise and competition that seemed to follow the Caldwell family everywhere they went. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to enjoy the quiet. Then my phone buzzed with another message confirming that everything was on schedule. I smiled and set the phone down. Downstairs, breakfast was already underway when I arrived. Vanessa was dressed as if she were attending a magazine photo shoot, instead of preparing for a day of travel. Ethan was busy explaining the details of a new investment opportunity to anyone willing to listen. Harold sat at the head of the table, nodding approvingly as if every business idea mentioned was destined to become a fortune. The atmosphere felt different this morning. Beneath all the casual conversations, I sensed nervous energy. People kept checking their phones. They whispered in small groups. More than once, I caught Ethan glancing toward a folder he carried everywhere. By the time we finished breakfast, my suspicions had grown stronger. This reunion was never about reconnecting as a family. It was about money. The answer arrived sooner than I expected. As the group prepared to leave for the airport, I stepped into the lobby to retrieve my sunglasses. Voices drifted from a nearby conference room. The door was slightly open. I recognized Ethan immediately. "If we can secure even one major investor, everything changes," he said. Another voice replied quietly. "The banks are getting impatient. We need capital soon." I froze. Ethan lowered his voice, but I could still hear enough. The luxury image. The expensive vacations. The endless displays of success. They were trying to attract investors by looking successful. Suddenly, every conversation from the past 2 days made sense. They were selling a story. Whether the story was true seemed far less important to them. I quietly walked away before anyone noticed me. Outside, the family loaded luggage into waiting vehicles. Vanessa spotted me and smiled. It was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Ready for another exciting day, Charlotte?" she asked. "Very ready," I replied. The drive toward Aspen Airport took less than 30 minutes. During the trip, Vanessa continued talking about exclusive destinations, luxury travel, and private clubs. She spoke as though she were delivering a lecture on success. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody challenged her. They all seemed eager to maintain the illusion. When the airport finally came into view, everyone appeared relieved. Ethan checked his watch. Harold reviewed travel documents. Vanessa adjusted her designer sunglasses and smiled confidently. They believed the day would unfold exactly as they expected. They believed they were still the most impressive people in the room. As our vehicles pulled into the terminal entrance, I looked beyond the main airport buildings toward a separate area hidden behind secure gates. My phone vibrated one final time. The message contained only 4 words. "We are ready, ma'am." I slipped the phone back into my purse and followed the family inside, knowing that within the next hour, every assumption they had made about me was about to be tested. Inside the terminal, the Caldwell family immediately gravitated toward the premium lounge. It was exactly the kind of place they loved. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the runways. Leather chairs sat arranged in perfect rows. A barista prepared specialty coffee behind a polished marble counter. Vanessa looked around with obvious satisfaction. "Now this is how travel should feel," she announced. Ethan nodded as he checked his phone for what must have been the 10th time that morning. I noticed the tension in his face. Whatever financial problems he was dealing with were clearly weighing on him more heavily than he wanted anyone to know. Still, appearances had to be maintained. Appearances were everything to the Caldwells. We settled into a seating area near the windows. For the next half hour, conversations drifted between travel plans and business opportunities. Harold spoke proudly about family legacy. Vanessa discussed exclusivity. Ethan continued talking about future growth and expansion. Listening to them felt like listening to people reciting lines from a script they had rehearsed for years. Eventually, Vanessa turned toward me again. "Charlotte, what are your plans after this trip?" she asked. "Anything exciting?" I smiled. "I have a few meetings scheduled." "Meetings?" she repeated with amusement. "Retirement seems busier than I expected." Several people chuckled politely. "Some opportunities are worth making time for," I replied. Vanessa lifted an eyebrow but said nothing more. A few minutes later, an announcement echoed through the terminal. Passengers for the Caldwell family's flight were invited to begin boarding. Everyone immediately gathered their belongings. Harold stood first. Ethan collected his briefcase. Vanessa adjusted her scarf and smiled confidently. The family began walking toward the departure gates. I remained seated. After several steps, Ethan noticed. "Charlotte," he asked. "They are boarding." "I know," I said calmly. "I am taking a different flight." The group stopped. Vanessa turned around. "A different flight?" she asked. "Since when?" "Since this morning." She frowned. "You never mentioned that. You never asked." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa laughed lightly. "Well, I hope they do not lose your luggage." The comment earned a few smiles. I simply stood, picked up my purse, and thanked them for the weekend. Ethan looked confused. Harold seemed mildly irritated. Vanessa appeared curious. "Where exactly are you flying?" she asked. I glanced toward the windows. Beyond the commercial terminals, visible in the distance, stood the secure gates leading toward the private aviation area. "Not far," I said. "Just somewhere I need to be." Before anyone could ask another question, a uniformed airport representative entered the lounge and looked directly toward me. He approached with professional confidence. "Ms. Whitmore," he asked, "everything is prepared. We are ready whenever you are." The room became unusually quiet. I could feel every pair of eyes following the exchange. The representative offered a courteous smile. "If you would like to follow me, transportation is waiting outside." I returned the smile and picked up my bag. Then I looked at the Caldwell family one last time. The confusion on their faces had already begun replacing the certainty they had carried all weekend. And this was only the beginning. I followed the airport representative through a side exit and into a waiting vehicle parked near the private aviation terminal. The distance was not far, perhaps half a mile, but it felt like traveling between two completely different worlds. Through the window, I could still see members of the Caldwell family standing near the lounge entrance. Even from that distance, their confusion was obvious. The representative remained professional and courteous. He spoke only when necessary, confirming my schedule and reviewing a few details about the flight. When we arrived at the private terminal, several staff members were already waiting. One of them greeted me by name and offered to handle my luggage. Another handed me a tablet containing documents that required my review before departure. Everything moved with quiet efficiency. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. Nobody was showing off. People were simply doing their jobs well. That was one of the things Richard had always appreciated about successful organizations. The truly capable people rarely felt the need to announce how important they were. As I stepped inside the terminal, memories of my late husband returned. Richard had started with almost nothing. During the early years of our marriage, We worked long hours building a logistics company focused on specialized air transportation. While others chased attention, Richard focused on relationships, reliability, and trust. Over time, the company expanded across the country. Eventually, it grew beyond anything we had imagined. After his passing, I retained a significant ownership position while stepping away from daily operations. Publicly, very few people knew the details. I preferred it that way. Wealth attracts curiosity, but privacy attracts peace. A few minutes later, one of the executives joined me in a private conference room. We reviewed several reports regarding expansion plans and new contracts. The numbers were encouraging. Demand continued to grow. New opportunities were opening in several regions. The meeting lasted nearly 40 minutes. By the time we finished, I felt more energized than I had all weekend. For the first time since arriving in Aspen, I was surrounded by people discussing real work rather than appearances. As I exited the conference room, my phone began vibrating repeatedly. I looked down and saw several missed calls. Ethan, then Harold, then Vanessa. A text message appeared moments later. Charlotte, where are you? Another followed almost immediately. We think there has been some misunderstanding. I stared at the screen for a moment before slipping the phone back into my purse. The timing was interesting. For 2 days, nobody had shown much interest in my plans, my experiences, or my opinions. Now suddenly they seemed desperate to speak with me. Outside the terminal windows, a sleek aircraft rested on the tarmac beneath the clear Colorado sky. Ground crews moved around it with practiced precision. The sight reminded me of something Richard often said. Character is revealed when circumstances change. Some people become kinder. Others simply become more interested. I had a feeling I was about to discover which category the Caldwell family belonged to. I was reviewing one final report when the assistant entered the room and quietly informed me that visitors had arrived asking to speak with me. I already knew who they were before she finished the sentence. I thanked her and gathered my things. As I walked through the terminal, I noticed several employees exchanging polite greetings. Some had worked with our company for years. Others were newer members of the team. What they all shared was professionalism. Nobody cared about appearances. Results mattered. Integrity mattered. Reliability mattered. Outside near the observation area, I found the Caldwell family waiting. The change in their behavior was impossible to miss. Vanessa was no longer carrying herself with effortless superiority. Ethan looked nervous. Harold appeared thoughtful, almost concerned. The moment they saw me, they began walking in my direction. Charlotte, Ethan said with an awkward smile, there you are. We have been trying to reach you. I noticed, I replied. Vanessa stepped forward. We were worried something had happened. The concern sounded unfamiliar coming from her. Throughout the entire weekend, she had shown very little interest in my well-being. Now suddenly she seemed eager to establish a connection. Everything is fine, I said calmly. Ethan glanced around the terminal. This place is impressive. It serves its purpose, I answered. He hesitated before asking the question that was clearly on everyone's mind. What exactly are you doing here? Before I could respond, a senior executive emerged from a nearby office. He approached with a warm smile and extended his hand. Ms. Whitmore, the board members have approved the proposal. Congratulations. We shook hands briefly. Thank you, Daniel. He nodded respectfully and continued on his way. Silence followed. I could almost see the calculations taking place behind Ethan's eyes. Vanessa looked from me to the executive and back again. Harold finally spoke. Board members, he asked. Proposal? I smiled gently. Business matters. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody made a joke about retirement. Nobody mentioned fixed incomes. The assumptions they had relied upon for years were beginning to crack. Ethan cleared his throat. Charlotte, I do not think I realized you were involved in something this large. Most people do not ask, I replied. Vanessa folded her arms. You never told us. You never seemed interested. Her expression tightened slightly. The answer was truthful, and truth can be surprisingly uncomfortable. At that moment, movement outside the windows drew everyone's attention. Ground crews were positioning equipment near the aircraft waiting on the tarmac. The polished fuselage reflected the afternoon sunlight. One of the pilots emerged from the stairway and spoke briefly with a member of the flight team. Vanessa stared through the glass. Is that your flight? She asked quietly. I followed her gaze toward the aircraft. Yes, I said. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The distance between perception and reality had finally become impossible to ignore. And the most revealing part was not their surprise. It was the sudden respect that seemed to appear the moment they realized how wrong they had been. For a long moment, nobody moved. The aircraft remained outside the window, gleaming beneath the afternoon sun, while the Caldwell family stood frozen between curiosity and disbelief. Vanessa was the first to recover. "That is quite impressive," she said carefully. The difference in her tone was subtle, but impossible to miss. Gone was the playful mockery. Gone was the effortless superiority. In its place was something much more cautious. Ethan nodded in agreement. "You never mentioned any of this." I smiled. "There was never a reason to." He glanced toward the aircraft again. "How long have you been involved with this company?" "Since the beginning." Harold looked genuinely surprised. "The beginning?" I nodded. "Richard and I built it together." That answer seemed to land harder than anything else I had said. For years, they had viewed me as a widow living quietly on memories of a successful husband. The possibility that I had helped create that success had apparently never occurred to them. Ethan lowered his voice. "I had no idea." "That is true," I replied. "You did not." Another uncomfortable silence followed. It was remarkable how quickly people changed once their assumptions disappeared. The same individuals who had spent the weekend talking over me were now listening carefully to every word. The same people who barely asked about my life suddenly seemed fascinated by my experiences. Vanessa stepped closer. "Charlotte, I hope you know we were only teasing you the other day." I looked at her calmly. "Which time?" A faint color rose in her cheeks. Ethan looked away. Harold adjusted his jacket. Nobody seemed eager to revisit specific conversations anymore. "You know what I mean," Vanessa said. "The car. The jokes. None of that was meant seriously." I thought about that for a moment. The interesting thing about disrespect is that it often disguises itself as humor. People say hurtful things and then hide behind a smile when challenged. "I understand," I said. "Humor tends to change depending on who is laughing." Vanessa offered a weak smile. Ethan quickly shifted the conversation. "We should stay in touch more often. There is clearly a lot we do not know about each other." That statement sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about it felt familiar. The sudden interest, the sudden warmth, the sudden desire to build a relationship. It had appeared only after new information entered the room. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Daniel confirming that departure preparations were complete. I slipped the phone into my purse and glanced toward the aircraft. Boarding would begin shortly. Ethan followed my gaze. "You know," he said casually, "I have been working on a business project that could really benefit from experienced guidance." There it was. The first real reason behind the conversation. Not family, not connection, opportunity. I simply smiled and listened. Richard used to say that patience reveals motives. If you stay quiet long enough, people eventually explain themselves. Standing there in the terminal, watching the Caldwell family carefully choose their words, I realized the most important revelation of the weekend had nothing to do with money. It was discovering exactly how differently people treated you once they believed you could offer them something valuable. "Experience guidance is valuable," I said, "but only when people are willing to listen before they need help." Ethan gave a small laugh, though it sounded strained. Vanessa remained unusually quiet. The confidence that had followed her all weekend seemed to have disappeared. For the first time since arriving in Aspen, she looked uncertain. Ethan adjusted his tie and tried again. "Actually, Charlotte, there is something I should probably tell you. We have been developing a project for almost 2 years. The potential is enormous. We have already invested a great deal of money into it." "I see," I replied. "The problem is timing," he continued. "Markets have been unpredictable. Financing has become more complicated." There it was. Not the entire truth, but enough of it. Harold stepped forward. "Ethan has worked very hard on this venture. The family believes in it." I nodded politely. That is important. What nobody seemed willing to mention was what I had overheard at the resort. The conversations about impatient banks, the search for investors, the pressure hiding beneath all the luxury. They had spent the entire weekend projecting success because they needed others to believe in it. Suddenly, Vanessa spoke. "You know, Charlotte, I have always admired how private you are." The statement almost made me smile. 24 hours earlier, she had treated my quiet nature as evidence that I had nothing interesting to contribute. Now the same quality had become admirable. "Have you?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "Of course. I simply nodded. Sometimes silence is more revealing than confrontation. At that moment, Daniel approached once more. Ms. Whitmore, we are ready for boarding whenever you wish. Thank you, I said. As he turned to leave, Ethan called after him. Excuse me, how long has Ms. Whitmore been involved with the company? Daniel looked surprised by the question. Since the beginning, he answered. She remains one of the principal owners. The reaction was immediate. Ethan blinked. Harold stared. Vanessa looked completely stunned. Daniel politely excused himself and walked away. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Harold cleared his throat. Principal owner, he repeated quietly. I could see them recalculating everything they thought they knew about me. Not just the aircraft. Not just the meetings. The company itself. The years of work. The scale of what Richard and I had built together. Ethan looked genuinely shaken. Charlotte, why did you never tell us any of this? I thought about the question carefully. Because the people who care about you do not require a balance sheet before offering respect. The words settled heavily between us. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Outside the windows, preparations for departure continued. Inside the terminal, another kind of realization was taking place. For years, they had measured people by appearances. Expensive cars, expensive vacations, expensive stories. Yet they had completely misjudged the one person who never felt the need to advertise anything at all. For a few moments, nobody said anything. The terminal felt strangely quiet despite the activity outside the windows. Ground crews continued their work. Flight staff moved with calm efficiency. Life carried on exactly as it always had. Yet for the Caldwell family, something had changed. The image they had built around me no longer existed. Ethan finally spoke. Charlotte, I think we may have misjudged you. I looked at him kindly. I think you may have misjudged what matters. He lowered his eyes. Harold sighed heavily. For the first time all weekend, he seemed less concerned with appearances and more concerned with reflection. Vanessa stood silently beside them. The confidence that had fueled so many of her comments was gone. In its place was discomfort. Not because she had discovered I was successful, because she had realized how differently she had treated someone she assumed was not. My phone vibrated one final time. Boarding was ready. I picked up my bag and glanced toward the aircraft waiting outside. Daniel approached with a courteous smile. Whenever you are ready, Ms. Whitmore. I nodded. Then I turned back toward the family. Ethan took a step forward. Charlotte, perhaps when you return, we could have lunch. There are some opportunities one would like to discuss. I smiled. I am sure there are. He seemed unsure how to respond. The conversation was no longer happening on the terms he had expected. Harold extended his hand. Safe travels. Thank you, I said warmly. Vanessa hesitated before speaking. I owe you an apology. Her voice was quiet. I should not have made assumptions. I studied her expression for a moment. There was sincerity there, or at least the beginning of it. We all make assumptions, I replied. The important thing is what we do after we realize we were wrong. She nodded slowly. No dramatic confrontation followed. No angry speeches. No public humiliation. Life rarely works that way. Most lessons arrive quietly. Most truths reveal themselves without raising their voices. I followed Daniel toward the exit leading to the aircraft. The Colorado air felt cool and clean as I stepped onto the tarmac. Behind me, the Caldwell family remained near the terminal windows watching. Ahead of me stood the next chapter of my life. As I climbed the stairs, I found myself thinking about Richard. He would have laughed at the entire situation. Not because of the aircraft. Not because of the business success. Because he always understood something many people never learn. Real wealth is not measured by what you own. It is measured by the freedom to remain yourself regardless of what others think. I settled into my seat and looked out the window as preparations for departure continued. Far in the distance, I could still see the terminal. The people inside had spent years chasing status, approval, and appearances. Yet none of those things had brought them peace. As the aircraft began moving, I felt unexpectedly grateful. Not for the success Richard and I had built. Not for the opportunities ahead. But for the reminder that character always matters more than image. Money can open doors. Titles can attract attention. Luxury can impress strangers. But respect should never depend on any of them. The richest thing I carried with me that day was not ownership in a company or access to an aircraft. It was the ability to walk away knowing exactly who I was, regardless of who failed to see it.